Capital Sonoro.
De vital importancia es un podcast cultural que trata temas serísimos con gente inteligentísima y que justo hoy tengo la oportunidad dorada de entrevistar a una de esas personas inteligentísimas que trata temas serísimos, pero además lo hace con gran ingenio. Se trata de Igor Vamos, que tiene un seudónimo que tal vez sea el más conocido, que es Mike Bonanno, miembro de The Yes Men, un grupo de activistas que desde los años 2000 están haciendo incursiones que un poco revelan esa cara banal y al mismo tiempo deforme del capitalismo corporativo para aquellos que insisten un poco en no verla. Igor, or should I say Mike, welcome to De Vital Importancia. Thank you so much for being here.
Gracias.
Entonces, bueno, yo voy a empezar hablándole sobre el arranque, y es cuando uno hace una búsqueda de Google de Igor, aparece como un educador. So when I googled you,
yeah.
you appear as an educator, which is great because if you'd appear as an artist, it would be deemed as irrelevant, though it is not. If you would be labeled as an activist, it would be just assigned to such a niche or such an activity which is many times labeled as marginal.
Yeah.
But an educator, it's huge impact. Do you like that? How do you
yeah, it's okay. I think that it's good to have a flexible identity that works for the context that you're in. So I think back to like when I started doing this kind of thing, I'd done a project called the Barbie Liberation Organization, where you switched the voice boxes of talking Barbie dolls and G.I. Joes and put them back on store shelves to be sold again like little cultural Trojan horses that would then, sneak into people's houses and do a kind of a culture ambush about the gender roles. And this was in 1993, it's 30 years ago. And I remember thinking, and I'm quite young at that time, so I got a bunch of things going against me for people listening to me. I'm young, I'm maybe an artist, nobody's gonna listen to this. Who cares? But, so I thought, okay, I need to be something else. So our group, which was called the Barbie Liberation Organization, we said was made up of veterans against war toys, and concerned parents, so it was like immediately it was like, I think if we change who we are, people aren't going to judge us immediately and they're going to listen to the message. It turns out with that project that the toys spoke for themselves. As soon as somebody sees a Barbie doll saying dead men tell no lies and making gun noises, they get it. So but still having a different identity can matter. And it sounds like here it's very similar to the US, where you don't want to be an activist, you don't want to be an artist, you want to be something that people are going to respect and listen to. In Europe, it's a little different. In a lot of countries, artists still are revered in a different way. And they'll be like, if you're an artist, you're allowed to speak. But that's not the case in the US.
No.
Artist is a way to just kick you to the curb. Yeah.
Yeah, entonces, bueno, mi pregunta era, Igor aparece como un educador, no como un artista que lo es, no como un activista que lo es, y eso un poco tiene sus implicaciones. Un educador está puesto como una posición de alto impacto, tiene, muy a pesar de lo que gana un educador, esto es mi nota editorial, pues un puesto reverencial en términos de su labor en la sociedad, a diferencia de lo que pasa en Colombia con artistas y activistas, que como lo dice él, pues es distinto en Estados Unidos. Y lo que cuenta es que pues, desde el comienzo él entendió que la identidad era primero maleable, pero además era necesario malearla, que era posible hacerlo, y que lo aprendió en un proyecto que se llama The Barbie Liberation Army, sí. el movimiento de liberación de las Barbies, en donde cogió G.I. Joes de los que hablaban y Barbies de las que hablaban y les intercambió los chips de las voces para que tuvieran pues roles de género distintos Y que al comienzo, pues siendo él un artista joven, pensó, pucha, ¿no? De artista nadie me va a creer, de activista pues todo el mundo me va a marcar, ¿no? Como queda marginalizado. Entonces decidió enmarcar este Barbie Liberation Army en dos movimientos. Uno que eran los veteranos de guerra contra los juguetes de guerra, que pues es realmente muy gracioso. Y el otro, padres preocupados, que en Colombia además tenemos una buena dosis de eso. Y que ahí entonces la gente un poco se lo tomó bien, pero que igual vio que una vez puesto ahí en las tiendas de juguetes, los muñecos, la Barbie diciendo "Dead men tell no lies", como que los juguetes literalmente estaban hablando solos y el mensaje se daba solo, pero que al mismo tiempo sí descubrió como un potencial inmenso en el cambio de identidad. Y que detecta que pasa un poco lo mismo aquí en Colombia con los artistas y los activistas, que nadie quiere ser un artista y nadie quiere ser un activista, pero en Europa en cambio sí existe todavía cierta reverencia hacia la posición del artista y se piensa que puede hablar. Nosotros, de hecho, en este podcast hemos tenido exactamente ese problema, y de eso vamos a hablar precisamente. ¿Qué le voy a preguntar a Igor? Nosotros en este podcast quisimos, de hecho, en algún punto hacer episodios especiales de Artbo, que de hecho hicimos uno para el fin de semana de Artbo, pero en Artbo 2022 quisimos hacer unas mesas de conversación con artistas sobre distintos temas de la ciudad, de la política, del activismo, del capitalismo, de todos los temas que a nosotros nos conciernen como, no sé, como humanos. Y la respuesta que nos dio la Cámara de Comercio fue, en grandes líneas, los artistas no hablan de eso. So, what I'm saying is, we try to make a series of special episodes of this podcast in Artpo, which is the art fair organized by the Cámara de Comercio. I just forgot how to say it in English. And it is a commercial, huge money trading art fair, which has the greatest talents in arts in Colombia, and has the greatest curatorial talents in Colombia in the service of this just huge fair. And we tried to make a series of special episodes just to talk about topics that concern we all, as humans, like capitalism, life in the cities, corporate capitalism, politics, and the answer by the Commerce Guild, maybe, was artists don't talk about that, which just surprised me because I studied arts and and we talked about it every time. So this image, just getting to what you said last, this image of the artists not being able to talk, not being able to make anything else, that production that enables him or her to participate in the public conversation is crazy, because you need a frame, you need a background, but still the art or maybe capitalism is trying to just separate the art from the persons.
Es en función de capitalismo. Yeah, it's like it's capitalism. It keeps putting more pressure on anybody who's trying to make art in a professional way to do less political stuff, because the market, it pays to do stuff that isn't political most of the time, and there's a fear actually among artists, I found, because when we ask people who are artists to collaborate with us on things, I've learned over time that if I want a great artist to collaborate, don't tell them what they're collaborating on.
You have to cheat them onto
and it's no fault of theirs. So, for example, this project we just did in Lisbon, we infiltrated a big conference, and we wanted to have very good dancers for this show. And we started asking people who were great dancers, not activists, but great dancers. And when we told them what was going on, every single one of them said, I can't do that because I might get a commercial job with this company later at some point. They have this idea that maybe. So it's the pressures of thinking that there might be a future job that prevents them from doing anything political, because their whole career is built on being apolitical. And so then I finally was like, well, fuck it. There's this really cool group of breakdancers who are political, because they're break dancers and they're teaching kids to break dance. They do programs in the community and they're amazing. But we're going to ask them, and we're just going to do it as if, we're going to tell them that we're working with an NGO. It's for a good cause. But we're not going to tell them that we're not that we're making fun of Adidas, because then they'll say no. And sure enough, we went, they did it, and it was hard for them afterward, because they're like, shit, I didn't know that weird animation was going to be playing while we were doing our thing, and I felt terrible. But we talked it through. I spent about 8 hours hanging out with them. We worked through it, and eventually they're like, okay, this is cool, But they couldn't. There had to be plausible deniability. They had to be able to say, we didn't know, in order to participate, because otherwise they were so worried about where the money would come from that they couldn't be political in that overt kind of way. It had to just be subtle. The acceptable thing, which is you help kids in a neighborhood, in a bad neighborhood, learn to overcome their hardship. It was just kind of like, it's great, but it's not like hard political.
Yeah, it's not fighting against child labor or exploitation.
No, exactly. Yes.
Entonces les voy a explicar un poco el contexto del proyecto del que estamos hablando. Pues porque, a ver, lo que dice Igor/Mike es: cada vez más hay un miedo creciente entre las personas que hacen arte, y con esto se refiere a todas las artes, a participar de contenidos políticos, que es raro porque eso un poco nutre la experiencia universitaria de cualquier persona que haya estudiado cualquier cosa en artes, pero a medida que han querido acercarse como organización a grandes artistas para pedirles que colaboren, la respuesta siempre es negativa, porque existe la percepción de yo en cualquier momento puedo estar trabajando para esta gente de la cual nos vamos a estar burlando. Entonces el último proyecto que presentaron en Lisboa fue una suplantación de ejecutivos de Adidas, en donde crearon una criptomoneda falsa y una experiencia falsa en una especie de metaverso llamado el Adiverse, en donde buscaban solucionar en el mundo virtual todos los problemas de explotación y trabajo infantil del mundo real, creando además una criptomoneda de las que apenas una fracción estaba disponible para los trabajadores. Entonces es una gran parodia, y estuvieron buscando grandes bailarines que participaran de esto, como en los eventos corporativos donde llevan todo tipo de números y espectáculos para ambientar como las presentaciones, y todo el mundo les estaba diciendo que no, y finalmente consiguieron un grupo de breakdancers que era políticamente activo, que estaba trabajando en las comunidades, enseñándole a muchachos y muchachas de barrios pobres a hacer breakdance, y ellos un poco aceptaron sin saber a qué se estaban metiendo. Entonces, que igual un grupo que es político tiene que tener la posibilidad de decir, nosotros no sabíamos lo que estaba haciendo, ¿no? Como que tiene que existir un margen de duda razonable sobre, ¿no? Pues para poder negar haber estado ahí conscientemente y poderse declarar también engañados por la iniciativa, porque es muy difícil combatir, obviamente, pues que un artista que depende también de ganarse grandes cantidades de dinero por trabajar para grandes marcas, después tenga que quedar como enemigo matriculado de esas marcas. Pues obviamente es tirarse los ingresos de una persona, y hace que la respuesta sea automáticamente no. Entonces, ¿qué le voy a preguntar ahora a Igor? Le voy a preguntar sobre los inicios de The Yes Men, y voy a tratar de enmarcarlo en un poco la historia de cómo ha sido el activismo o las guerras culturales que han tenido lugar desde comienzos de los 2000. So let's talk about the beginnings of the Yes Men. How did you get to be an organization? How do you get to make this collective? How did you choose to be these impersonators?
Yeah. Well, I had done this Barbie Liberation Organization project, and then I met Jacques, or Andy, the other key yes man, because he had done a similar project where he was working at a video game company as a programmer, and he added a lot of unauthorized content to the game that emerged in a certain day. It was like an Easter egg, they call it in the hacking world. And so we had heard about each other's projects, and he got in touch, and then we started working together remotely. We weren't in the same place. At first, we had an anti-corporate corporation that we ran for a few years. It was called rtmark.com, and the idea was that it was all about this idea of corporate power and about how people doing mischief maybe should have the same amount of protection that corporations do from the law based on the legal structure to be able to do this crazy shit. Like, why shouldn't we have the same rights as them to fuck with people and fuck with the system, And so we formed a kind of corporation, and then the corporation had investors who would put in money, and then people who wanted to do these subversive projects that were maybe a little bit, legally questionable, like a copyright infringement or things like that. So it was this kind of shady company that we ran for a couple of years. It was it was an art project, but it also was functional. But through that, we started getting organized, and one of the things we were doing was putting together these fake websites that looked like corporate websites in the early years of, when the companies were just getting onto the web. And that confusion, that sense of mirrors and play, mistaken identity, was very fun to play with. And one of the sites was a World Trade Organization website, and it turned out that people really liked asking us questions. I mean, they thought we were the World Trade Organization, and we started answering, and eventually it led to us attending conferences in person as the World Trade Organization. And that's when we became the Yes Men, because we thought we are basically like saying yes to everything, all this kind of weird, subtle violence that's happening in these meeting rooms, where people are deciding futures that actually impact people halfway around the world. Yeah.
Entonces, lo que me cuenta Igor es que al comienzo había hecho esta organización por la liberación de las Barbies y se encontró después con Andy o Jock, que es el otro Yes Man principal, pues el fundador, el socio senior, y fundaron al principio una corporación falsa que buscaba proponer cosas subversivas y problemáticas, como por ejemplo transgresiones del derecho de propiedad intelectual, pero además pues suplantaciones y juegos un poco sobre la base misma del capitalismo corporativo, que es que si algo se pone encima el sello de que es una corporación, gana ciertos derechos entre comillas que le permiten pues básicamente cagarse a la gente y joder al sistema, ¿no? Como decir, meterse o acomodar las reglas a su antojo, y lo que hicieron pues fue hacer una corporación anticorporativa en donde habrían espacio para que la gente pudiera hacer ese tipo de proyectos, y los presentaban un poco con el desparpajo de las corporaciones que pasan pues todo tipo de transgresiones a todo tipo de derechos humanos, empezando sobre la base de que son corporaciones. Ahorita vamos a hablar sobre, yo sé que les está sonando muy conocido, pero ahorita vamos a hablar sobre eso. Y empezaron a suplantar páginas de internet en una época en donde las páginas de internet todavía eran muy nuevas, y en esas terminaron suplantando a la Organización Mundial del Comercio y empezaron a llamarlos a conferencias, y ellos empezaron a decir que sí, efectivamente se volvieron los Yes Men porque estaban efectivamente diciendo sí. Dentro de este sistema de auditorios y cuartos de reuniones en donde ocurren precisamente todos estos, pues todos los intríngulis y todo el mecanismo de este capitalismo corporativo que tiene una incidencia política global tan fuerte, y es así como terminaron volviéndose como suplantadores del mundo corporativo y se volvieron los Yes Men. Yes Men, que es además una forma de llamar a estos ejércitos de personas encorbatadas que están siguiendo a todos lados a un líder de negocios, a un líder político, y simplemente le dicen que sí, que sí, que sí, como un poco los minions de estos grandes líderes corporativos. Es algo que normalmente se denomina un Yes Man. Entonces, mi siguiente pregunta va a ser sobre, primero, cómo esos sellos que se ponen afectan definitivamente la capacidad de acción de una u otra organización. Y esto por supuesto alcanza los niveles estatales, pero además le voy a preguntar sobre lo muy difícil que ha sido estar todo el tiempo corriendo la línea, porque la realidad termina pareciéndose tanto a la ficción e incluso superándola de muchas maneras. So my next question is a mixed one, because I'd like to talk about how these labels, corporate labels or democratic labels, allow some organizations, and in the case of the violence going on in Gaza, states, full states, to act as they please just because they are labeled as a democracy, just because they are labeled as a corporation, just because they are labeled as a business, and you can't be against businesses, and you can't be against liberal democracies, and you can't be against Occidental values, Western values. So how do you, or how has it worked for you in this constant being another person and the activist, another person and a mischievous artist? And how do you cope with the fact that reality and corporate capitalism tends to just move the threshold further on, to go further on? And so if you impersonate the World Trade Organization, then capitalism just goes, no? If you talk about collateral damage and acceptable collateral damage, then the warmongers just move that line further on. How do you get to still be mischievous, still be funny, still be or to, I don't know, to trespass that line?
I think one thing that helps in this context is to take a long view of history,
Yeah.
and to see how mischief and these modes of criticizing power have been around forever. And forever in terms of human, civilization isn't that long. But during that time, there's been many ups and downs, times when people had more power, less, where there were amazing experiments in sort of democracy or proto-democratic equal societies, and then somewhere they were totally exploded and became, a completely exploitative system. So I think with the long view, you can say, okay, this mode of intervention in the system has a function, and even at these times when it seems like it's kind of less impactful because of the acceleration of what's happening with capitalism, or the extreme nature of, the way politicians wield power, or the way asymmetric, punishment is taken out, on entire peoples, a sort of a genocide in response to a terrorist act. Those sorts of things, it's hard to keep a focus, but at the same time you have to say, okay, well, this is not a time to just let off and stop doing it, this is a moment, and another moment is coming, and so I think that's a part of it, is that also just because capitalism is so effective doesn't mean that it's going to not hit some kind of wall at some point. That's what I would see anyways, that there will be shifts. It's just we don't know what they are yet. And I think so it's hard to function though, and last decade things went very differently than what we were expecting, in terms of, in the US it was like being in a asylum, like suddenly it's like, oh, that guy is elected. It's so strange, it's so incomprehensible. And then you think you have to throw away everything that you were doing or plan to do and try to come up with a new framework. But it's not a reason to stop. I think that's the important thing, is that it's not a reason to stop. And sometimes it means that you're closer to the change that maybe could happen. If you look back, and historically, there's some very repressive or oppressive moments that happen just before things get better. So,
Do you ever get the urge, the anxiety to see faster results? Because sometimes, and in pressing times like this, it is easy to fall for the hastiness of just seeing something happening right now. Maybe something of all the twisted stuff that's going on in the world stopping, being it war, child labor, poor people being exploited, or maybe this escalation of authoritarianism in the whole world. Something has got to change, and maybe that perspective you give me, it's useful indeed. But do you ever get that anxiety, that urge?
Totally. Totally. And it's often you feel like what you're doing or just did is kind of useless, but then you have moments when it feels good and it's working again. And I think part of it is that also saying, okay, we've been fighting for one thing for a while, and maybe if that's not working, you go and choose another angle or another issue, the one where you know you can have an impact, and maybe form alliances. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's an activist game at that point. It's like, how do you still function in a system that is so stacked against you, because everybody has to buy in to capitalism. It's our culture. It's become the global culture, the culture of capitalism. It's supplanted all of our cultures as we knew them before. And the problem with that is that it has a way of putting money in the driver's seat. So everything becomes fiscalized, and then there's very little room to move. And so you end up having to, use the tactics of the trickster, which are, agility, mobility, kind of like, you rely on being smarter or more clever or maybe sometimes more stupid than the system, than the system that you're fighting against. But it's hard because now it's global and it becomes invisible like any culture. It's like we don't even know we're doing it anymore. But every day, we're participating in holding up capitalism, keeping it going, even though it's destroying us. So that's,
Entonces, mi pregunta era sobre mover la línea y sobre cómo el capitalismo, la realidad siempre termina superando a la ficción, y la respuesta es que sí, pues que lo que a ellos les ha servido es tener una perspectiva mucho más amplia de la historia, como tratar de verlo en una perspectiva histórica larga que les permita entender también y un poco lidiar con el hecho de que las cosas sí efectivamente avanzan, muchas veces a un ritmo más acelerado, que muchas veces toman dimensiones muy extrañas, como pues el hecho de que Trump haya sido presidente de Estados Unidos y que ahora además nota editorial pues está tan cerca de serlo otra vez. Y es decir, nos estamos volviendo locos, ¿no? Y estas cosas que nosotros hacemos tienden a parecer superadas por los movimientos de las corporaciones reales y de los movimientos globales reales, pero al mismo tiempo eso no es una razón para parar. No solamente no es una razón para parar, es una razón para seguir, porque al final de cuentas los cambios sí se dan, es decir, sí hay cambios verificables, sí existen cambios que están ocurriendo, y muchas veces parece que estos umbrales como de extremismo y de extremo deterioro de las cosas parecen anteceder también a grandes cambios, y puede que el capitalismo haya logrado un poco ganar la partida de correr la línea una y otra vez, pero el capitalismo también tiene un techo, y ese techo tarde o temprano va a terminar tocándolo, y pues ahí está. Yo le pregunté entonces que si no sentía la ansiedad o el afán de ver cambios como operar de manera más inmediata, porque pues es muy fácil caer en la desesperanza cuando uno trata y ve que las cosas van cogiendo el cariz que tienen, sea esto por la locura del capitalismo corporativo, que además es el que patrocina los mismos movimientos ambientales que luego se encarga de negar completamente con sus acciones, o la deriva fascista autoritaria que está teniendo lugar en todo el mundo, es decir, como cualquiera de estos problemas que son suficientemente grandes para abrumar a cualquier persona. Un poco lo que dice es que sí, que definitivamente siente ese afán, pero que al mismo tiempo es precisamente eso lo que les ha enseñado, o el juego de sentir que se les gana constantemente, versus el hecho de estar efectivamente haciendo algo que es significativo y que tiene un peso específico y que tiene una presencia específica. Les ha permitido un poco identificarse como unos traviesos, como un trickster, como un... no puedo creerlo, como un bribón, es decir, como tratando de jugar precisamente a eso, esconderse a la movilidad, como a jugar a ser más inteligentes, más astutos, más rápidos, o incluso, de ser necesario, más estúpidos que el capitalismo y que la cultura a la que se enfrentan. Y que claro, obviamente eso hace que sea muy difícil, porque todo está metido en términos de plata, y que el capitalismo lo que hace pues es obligarnos a perpetuarlo mientras nos destruye. La posibilidad de ese cambio pues obviamente toma más que eso, pero dentro de lo que se hace pues es precisamente tratar de subvertir esa cultura que mantiene vivo el capitalismo para tratar de frenarlo, y en algún punto ha de frenar.
Oye, profe, ¿tus estudiantes son artistas? El momento para que todas y todos conozcan sus obras ha llegado. Invítalo a listar sus dibujos, cuentos, animaciones, fotografías, esculturas o cualquier representación artística. Ve a nuestras redes sociales, @eurekatucanal. Visita nuestra página eurekatucanal.com o escribe a nuestro WhatsApp 322-510-8955 y conoce toda la información para ser parte de Eurecrea. Comparte tu arte.
Ahí entonces yo lo que le voy a preguntar es sobre el tratamiento con los medios, porque hay algo que a mí me llama mucho la atención, y es que cuando por ejemplo empezó el movimiento Occupy, más o menos en 2009, la frase era: no le crean a los medios corporativos, ¿no? Don't believe corporate media. Y después con el tiempo, ¿no? Y esto siguió y se perpetuó durante la primavera árabe de 2011, unos 3 años, y 2 años después de eso, 3 años después de eso, cuando empezó la campaña presidencial en Estados Unidos, la frase que adoptó la ultraderecha personificada en Donald Trump fue exactamente la misma: Don't believe corporate media. Y esa transformación de los medios de comunicación ha sido algo verdaderamente significativo. Yo estoy metido en eso, todos estamos un poco metidos en la observación de la desinformación como un fenómeno global que muchas veces incluso se ampara en la libertad de expresión para deteriorar las bases de la democracia. Entonces vamos a hablar de ese tema tan sencillito. So, Igor, what I'd like to talk about now is one element of this cultural capitalism that is kind of a complex and volatile problem, which is the media. Mm-hmm. When the Occupy movement began in 2009, 2008, the phrase or the motto was: don't believe corporate media, don't believe their lies. And yes, they were lying in the name of corporate capitalism, and they were making profit out of misinforming or just make face washing to all these corporate moguls and all these corporate driven governments and all the imperialism, etc., etc. And when the Arab Spring came, then it felt like a global movement, because media was just portraying another thing, and inside the Arab countries, media was just being this huge propaganda apparatus for the governments. So people felt like drawn together by this motto of don't believe corporate media. But years later, not many years later, 3 years later, in 2015, when the presidential campaign for 2016 began, Donald Trump and the far right, the alt-right, began using that same motto: don't believe the corporate media, don't believe fake news. And these fake news were just flipped from this trope used by the left and the new activism to be this trope of the alt-right. So it was hard to see, or it was just so hard to swallow, the need to embrace or endorse some communication outlets that were just years before labeled as corporate media, and trying to rely on them to get your information, which is the case for CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And now we are living in a world in which this information is just global. It's just like the air. You breathe this information, and this information is just being enforced and encouraged and moved and fed constantly by media outlets that thrive on that, need that, and that use these universal free press value just to undermine the basis of democracy on its behalf. So what do you do with that? How do you cope with that media environment we have right now?
Yeah, it's one of the big questions of that ties into everything right now, because you have all the disinformation, and then you have everybody divided into their little sectors, their silos, their groups. You know, they all share information on the social media platforms. That's where people consume information, or you know, it ends up meaning that each group has their own reality. Everybody lives their own reality. There's nothing we agree on anymore. Because at least with the corporate media, the monolithic media, everybody read the same newspaper. And you had a baseline where you could say, okay, this is a reality. This is a reality that we can agree or disagree on, but it's the reality. And now you invent your reality with a group of your friends. And that reality can be completely unhinged. It can be nuts. And so how to contend with that, and especially now what's happening is the stories are also getting written automatically, you know, because then you take a couple of articles that are being written by people, and then you have the machine rewrite them or invent them, make them up, and you can have it be automated too. You can just tell it to write a news article about this thing. And that's, you know, what happens now. I notice it with our stuff, because when we do an action, like we just did this thing in Lisbon, and you know, there's a few mainstream news articles that are quite good, written by real journalists, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff on these websites that sound like news websites, and if you read it closely, you realize that it's completely manufactured. It's just AI that's writing the story, pulling stuff from other sources. And it gets a lot of stuff wrong, sometimes in very funny ways. And it's so you just think, oh, this is now going into hyperdrive too, because you know what we had in 2015 was a bunch of people planning stories, and we had a lot of subterfuge, but now it's becoming automated as well. And so it's hard to know where to go with this, except that you know, it does require. I mean, it requires. Hopefully there's some kind of government intervention in this, because we can't really have a functioning democracy. One of the principles of democracy is that you have an informed citizenry. You can't have that without an informed citizenry. That's why a lot of countries have protections for their media landscape and rules. And it's, you know, otherwise you end up throwing away democracy. And it's not, and arguably that's what happened already. You know, it's like nobody's driving the boat anymore. It's just money, and all the incentives of money are to keep people confused and not have and have less control. So, yeah, it's a huge challenge. I don't have the answers, but I know that it's something that we try to address. And actually, as an educator, it's something I try to do. So in my classes with students, the first thing that they have to do I have a class where the first thing they have to do is set up fake social media profiles for themselves, and using a number of different political leanings, you know, so that they can see, so it gives them a window into another world. Because if they go live as another person in that world, they can see the stuff they wouldn't. Like, okay, now you're fitting a different demographic. This character is going to be an old MAGA supporter. And then they see stuff that old people see, and they see stuff that MAGA people see that never otherwise would reach their feed as somebody who's 18 years old and who has sort of no politics, which most of my students do. They come in, it's an engineering school, they come in with no politics, and then they seem to sometimes find some. But in the US, it's often that way with, kids who are relatively privileged and grow up in the suburbs. They often have nothing there. I mean, a vague sense of justice, but that's about it. So, yeah, it's hard. So I try to address it in different contexts, and with the work as well, we try, but we also haven't really figured out how to use social media effectively. It's hard. It's hard because also there's also unseen things that are happening. People who are posting a lot of stuff, pro-Gaza stuff right now, are seeing their accounts, shadow banned and things like that. And that was happening with the MAGA people too. They literally were being censored. It's just a fact. They were like, I can't do this anymore for a good reason, because democracy was like up for grabs, but at the same time, it's not the way to deal with it, is to have a private company decide who should look at what. There should be like a way that governments ensure that people get accurate information to be that informed citizenry that democracy requires.
Yeah, and yet this initiative that the Biden government started trying to monitor and combat misinformation just crashed so hard. It was so difficult to see just how through misinformation they managed to bring down the misinformation monitoring initiative of and this federal office that Biden was planning to install just to give people accurate information, just because there is a business that thrives on misinformation.
Yeah, and this is it seems like it's being treated as a new thing, like, oh, we have to deal with this, but it's something that governments have been doing, since the age of the printing press. Is trying to regulate in the interest of the public, especially with broadcast media and radio and television. If you look at U.S. history, there's been a lot of rules and regulations that have come about in order to try to make the media beneficial to the public and useful to the public, with the idea that the public is supposed to govern, that's kind of out now, and it's been replaced in a way with this ideology that's around the idea of liberty, individual liberty. In the U.S. anyway, it's like the libertarian thing is so strong, that it's, as soon as you try to regulate, and you're like, well, you're regulating, and that is going to fuck up it's going to fuck up everything, because you need a pure system where everybody can do whatever they want, and somehow that's going to result in something better. But I mean, that's what a lot of people advocate.
And the whole state of Texas.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as soon as Biden says, we're working on regulating, they're like, oh, no, not regulation. Then the government is going to be in control, the mysterious government. It's like, well, not so much, but maybe.
Yeah, but still, an American government is not to be trusted.
No, not at all.
Nor a Colombian one, nor an Argentinian one, nor a Bolivian one,
No.
It's difficult just to choose where to get to, because if there is a collective solution, still organizing people is so hard. It's so hard, because maybe that libertarian point of view services some possibilities of what is not quite happening yet with the government and the lives of the people, but it's still preventing collectivization of many dialogues that have to take place in order to get to real solutions, ¿no?
Yeah, for sure.
Entonces la pregunta es, bueno, ¿qué hacer con los medios? Entonces lo que dices es, bueno, nosotros tampoco tenemos las respuestas. No solamente ha sido una cosa extraña ver el fenómeno desde 2015, cuando empezaron las burbujas de eco o lo que se llaman los silos, es decir, estas o lo que nosotros llamamos el algoritmo, y es como estas burbujas en donde nosotros empezamos a ver solamente las cosas que postea la gente que piensa exactamente como nosotros, y empezamos a pensar que nosotros estamos amparados por una aparente mayoría que aparentemente nos da la razón y que lleva a la gente a pensar que la otra parte o la contraparte no existe, y eso ha sido pues un problema, pero tiene un ingrediente adicional sobre el cual además yo no había pensado, y tiene toda la razón, y es que eso está además automatizado, porque ahora hay inteligencias artificiales que están utilizando información previamente hecha para sacar un montón de noticias. Entonces es muy fácil entrenar una inteligencia artificial para, con base en ciertas fuentes, empezar a producir contenido y contenido y contenido y contenido, y los agregadores de contenido precisamente lo que hacen es tratando de solucionar la incomodidad de no sé, poner a la gente a escribir con sus manos, crear, pues, es decir, no solamente está esta desinformación que es natural a cualquier sistema de burbujas, porque pues niega la opinión de otra porción de la humanidad, sino que esta desinformación está siendo automatizada, y eso pues está generando un problema gigante, y pues nace, o es un problema que el mismo Igor ha tratado de abordar como educador, y es pues poner a las personas en los zapatos de otras personas, que es un poco el mismo juego como de suplantar o encarnar a otra persona. Entonces decirle a un estudiante de una carrera relacionada con ingeniería, una carrera técnica, que se ponga en los zapatos de un señor viejo partidario de Trump, para que vea las noticias que ve, para que tenga la oportunidad como un poco de romper esas burbujas y ver la manera de solucionarlo, pero pues al mismo tiempo esa desinformación pues tendría que estar siendo abordada de alguna manera, porque efectivamente estamos viendo lo que está pasando con la democracia, y el problema con las redes sociales es que son empresas privadas que están regulando qué ve la gente y qué no ve la gente. El ejemplo básico es ahorita hay cuentas que están hablando sobre el genocidio en Gaza que están siendo shadow banned, es decir, el algoritmo las oculta. Entonces puede postear lo que sea, pero la mayoría de la gente no ve lo que se está posteando, porque está automatizada la respuesta a que cualquier cosa que se haga pro Palestina o pro cese al fuego o lo que sea, o que esté denunciando lo que está pasando en Gaza, pues va a ser escondida o va a ser ocultada por el algoritmo de redes. Pero exactamente lo mismo estaba pasando también con los partidarios del MAGA, es decir, del trumpismo, hace unos años, y puede que lo hicieran por unas buenas razones, pero el problema es que es una empresa, desde unos escritorios privados, los que están decidiendo qué es lo que la gente ve y qué es lo que la gente no. Entonces, independientemente de lo que está pasando, pues, si hay un problema con el acceso a la información, porque alguien tiene que regularlo, y la otra opción que existe hacia la mano pues son los gobiernos. Entonces, mi contrapregunta era que precisamente el gobierno de Biden había tratado de hacer una oficina de monitoreo y regulación de la desinformación para combatir precisamente este problema, pero la respuesta pues no solamente fue negativa, fue estrepitosamente negativa. Le cayeron encima al gobierno Biden, y a punta de desinformación, diciendo que era el Ministerio de la Verdad, que era una cosa orwelliana, que entonces se lo tumbaron. Entonces la respuesta pues es sí, que efectivamente hay un problema, y es también pues la confianza. Es decir, alguien tendría que hacerse cargo, porque hay un problema también con la democracia, es que pues uno podría decir básicamente que la democracia ya fracasó. O sea, creo que es una discusión que va a quedar ahí flotando al menos por este año, en lo que se refiere a los mecanismos en los cuales la gente lo hace, pero que además existe en Estados Unidos una posición muy dada al libertarianismo, que es los que dicen que cualquier regulación del gobierno es una vulneración de la libertad individual, y que la libertad individual es la medida canon de la libertad, es decir, que cualquier persona debería ser libre de hacer lo que se le dé la gana. Después podemos discutir esto en otro episodio de este podcast, pero pues decir que cualquier cosa que sea una regulación es una transgresión y es una agresión contra las personas. Entonces lo que yo le decía, y en lo que quedamos, es que pues efectivamente este tropo libertario sirvió, sobre todo si era el siglo XIX, servía mucho para pensarse la relación de un individuo contra su gobierno o con su gobierno, pero que lo que estaba haciendo también era prevenir que mucha gente se colectivizara y pudieran salir iniciativas ciudadanas que abordaran este problema de la desinformación y generaran un diálogo público. Entonces voy a hacer dos preguntas. La primera pregunta es sobre cómo escogen o cómo diseñan los proyectos, cómo es el proceso de Yesmen, y luego vamos a hablar sobre ya asuntos de la actualidad para terminar en una nota, por supuesto, bajísima. So, I'll ask you two more questions, or place two more topics. The first one is I'd like to know how your creative process works. How do you choose your projects? How do you design hijinks? How do you decide where to hack on, or does it just falls into your laps?
Sometimes you make it and sometimes it happens to you. But in the beginning, we were part of the anti or alter globalization movement. And so we were doing things specifically about neoliberalism, and it was fitting into this movement in the 90s that really was inspired by the zapatistas and that was against these enforcement mechanisms for neoliberalism. And so then we could just do things on our own as part of the movement and have fun with it, whatever way seemed to make sense, and whatever was drawing our attention. But then we began to realize after that movement sort of broke up in the post 9/11 period, that to be effective we should connect with movements and campaigns and do our actions at critical moments when they needed attention for those campaigns. And so then we started collaborating with organizations, and we've done that pretty much ever since. Most of the time, an organization comes to us and says, hey, I have this problem. We're trying to get people to know more about this issue because of X, Y, and Z, right? And then we work with them and try to, got a little bit of a...
do on.
And so then some of those organizations come with a budget too. They come with money because they have apparatus for raising money, like a Greenpeace, for example. We've done a lot of collaboration with them because they have a fundraising apparatus, they have campaigns and specific goals, and so we can fit into that framework really well by doing something that's causes a lot of attention to happen at a critical moment, and usually in cheaper ways than the ways that they do, because like they have entire ships that are traveling around. It's extremely expensive to do that. And so we come in and we say, and actually this has happened where they would, there would be a legal judgment that would mean they couldn't chase the oil rig with their ship, and suddenly they have a couple $1 million that they're not able to use the way they intended. And then they say, hey, could you do something for a tiny little fraction of that? And so so we work that way now mostly. Although sometimes we just have something we're enthusiastic about and we just take it on ourselves and just, so like one example is that we had the 30th anniversary of the Barbie Liberation Organization thing, and this year I gathered the old crew back together again to do something. And it's a little bit like, one of those heist films like Ocean's 13 or something, where you're like, you get the old crew out of retirement to kind of try to pull something off one more time. And that was more like just a passion that came about because Mattel was making a move. Often it's you're responding to something in the environment. A company does something and then you just feel like, oh, I have to respond to that. I have to answer that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just such a contemporary topic. Yeah, gender roles. We are just plagued with so much transphobia right now.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, it's weird. Well, it's one of these things where it's just what do they call it, dog whistle, or it's that politics where it's standing in for a bunch of other things. It's just convenient to take out a bunch of rage on trans people. But it happened before in the 70s. There was a similar thing that happened where the right, actually it was the Reagan Thatcher era, when the right really focused on these trans people as as something to fear, which it's bizarre. But I mean, when you think about it, it's like, really, that's the problem you're going to focus on? But it worked really well, even at that moment, in terms of forming the modern conservative movement. It was really, that was like part of that part of that ecosystem. You know, there was issues about a tennis player in the U.S. who was trans. There was like a bunch of people that they were going after in the 70s, just as Reagan was coming up. So early 80s, 1982. So yeah, and so the Barbie Liberation Organization thing, we're actually going beyond that too, because in a way in 1993 we were dealing with that, but with the current thing, it's also saying like Mattel is presenting an image of Barbie as if it's been a feminist toy all along, you know, and now there's a feminist movie, but underneath, Barbie is still made of plastic, which is oil. It's literally oil. And made by exploited, mostly women workers in places like Mexico and China and Southeast Asia, you know, where they're making subsistence living in these factories. And so the political economy of the toy hasn't changed a bit. It's very anti-feminist. It's very anti-ecological. You know, it's like a trick. It's like Mattel has done this magic trick where they've taken the identity politics and they've kind of said, okay, we're going there too. And in the process, we're going to miss all the rest of the politics that are there, that should be there. Yeah. I mean, so that's why we released a Barbie that was made of mushrooms. That was the idea was that mushroom Barbie, mycelia Barbie, was not made of plastic, and was celebrating the eco warriors, Greta Thunbergs and Julia Butterfly Hills. These women who are being arrested in the name of the environment. They had to. That was the criteria. They had to be people who are going to jail a lot. So.
Bueno, la respuesta es que muchas veces lo diseñan, o sea, muchas veces están pensándose los temas que van sacando de la cultura, que van apareciendo además en la coyuntura. Muchas veces simplemente les pasa, muchas veces pasa que organizaciones y ONGs quisieran hacer piezas de activismo que no pueden continuar por la simple incoherencia que supone, como cuando una organización ambientalista está utilizando demasiados combustibles fósiles o está moviendo un barco, ¿no? Tiene demasiadas emisiones, cuando tiene demasiadas emisiones, y eso un poco da una fracción y los llaman como, bueno, quisieran hacer algo por la fracción del presupuesto, que obviamente en términos de lo que supone un presupuesto para activismo y artes, pues es un montón o lo suficiente, y muchas otras cosas empiezan a aparecer o son temas con los cuales son verdaderamente apasionados. Nosotros vamos a dejar los enlaces para que ustedes tengan la oportunidad de ver y conocer el trabajo de The Yes Men, y pues entiendan un poco también de qué estamos hablando aquí. Entonces, un poco lo que está pasando, por ejemplo, es la película de Barbie. Entonces, la película, o con motivo de la película de Barbie y los 30 años de la Organización para la Liberación de los Barbies, entonces un poco reunieron al equipo viejo, dice Igor, como si fuera un poco Ocean's 11, ¿no? En donde hacen otra vez una reunión del viejo equipo para volver a dar un golpe certero, y entonces efectivamente hicieron como un trabajo conmemorativo, aprovechando que aparece la película de Barbie. Lo que yo le digo es que además está muy a propósito, porque en este momento estamos viendo una ola de transfobia como muy marcada, y lo que él dice pues es que sí, que efectivamente cuando hay como grandes escaladas de movimientos de derecha tienden a venir apuntaladas por un discurso de odio contra la gente trans, y recuerda que eso pasó a finales de los 70, comienzos de los 80, en el ascenso del reaganismo, cuando empezó a ascender como esta derecha extrema republicana de Reagan. Esto también empezó a darse a finales de los 70 con un montón de señalamientos contra la población trans, es decir, que esto es un discurso de odio que se repite, pero que sobre todo se repite porque se está instrumentalizando. Y pues que esta política de la identidad, o los identity politics, pues lo que se está haciendo es utilizarlo en favor obviamente también del interés corporativo, y ahí está la película de Barbie, ¿no? Como que Barbie saca esta película como si siempre hubiera sido un juguete feminista, y pues la película es una película feminista, pero se está obviando el hecho de que Barbie está completamente hecha de plástico, lo cual es petróleo, es decir, son emisiones de carbono y son combustibles fósiles, pero además de eso se está produciendo en fábricas en China, en el sudeste asiático, en México, en donde mujeres, sobre todo mujeres, están trabajando en unas condiciones absolutamente abyectas para sacar adelante el producto que después se vende como el emblema, ¿no? El nuevo emblema feminista. Entonces lo que hicieron fue hacer una especie de una Barbie hecha de hongos que no utiliza plástico, pues como promocionarla como un producto en honor a todas las eco-warriors, pues estas guerreras de la lucha de los activistas contra el cambio climático como Greta Thunberg, que están siendo constantemente encarceladas. Entonces eso fue un poco el juego que hicieron, pero pues esto muestra hasta qué punto hay cosas que caen como problemas que les llegan o que les plantean y que nacen, de ahí nacen iniciativas, y otros que pues ellos tienen simplemente o que están metidos dentro del movimiento. Ellos empezaron metidos dentro del movimiento antiglobalización, esto también es una cosa muy de comienzos de los 2000, mitad de los 2000, y luego pues se han ido evolucionando obviamente y siguiendo un poco la línea de estar persiguiendo este tipo de engaños y subterfugios del capitalismo corporativo. Con lo cual voy a llegar a mi última pregunta, y es una pregunta muy abstracta y muy grande, y es si existe campo para la utopía. Y la pregunta es porque en este momento estamos atendiendo esta violencia gigante en Gaza, que está amparada por poderes occidentales que han tratado de vender la democracia como el último refugio de la libertad humana y como los valores, ¿no? Como este fracaso del multilateralismo de Occidente, del humanitarianismo, de un montón de cosas. Y por otro lado, eventos que precisamente lo que hacen es mostrar la cara más cruda de hasta qué punto el capitalismo corporativo ha cooptado aquello que se suponía que no representaba, como la COP. Ya se viene la COP de este año. 1000 veces se ha hablado durante los últimos 5 o 6 años sobre cómo llegan a la COP todos los líderes mundiales en sus jets privados, produciendo una cantidad de emisiones absolutamente ridículas de gas carbónico, lo cual pues es la contradicción absoluta de lo que supone el espíritu de la COP, que se está haciendo además en países petroleros, que ha requerido de la construcción de mini ciudades completamente nuevas, es decir, que está hecho de una manera tan antisostenible que es ya perfectamente evidente que está siendo pagada por el lobby petrolero, que no está solucionando nada y que se está volviendo un poco una máscara de la desesperanza ambiental en un año que ha sido catalogado como el año más caliente de la historia. Entonces voy a ponerle ese tema tan harto para terminar. So, to end our interview, Igor, I have the worst topic of them all, and my abstract and macro question is there still room for utopia? And I ask this because we are living in a moment in which this huge horror and violence is being unleashed on the people in Gaza, as a reflection on a historical violence of years, because this is not a new problem, but this is a horrid new 1 month and a half phase that we are just looking at or getting in real time being broadcasted at us to our phone screens, and we are just seeing not just this violence, but we are seeing this abyss that is widening between the people that goes to protest against what Israeli state is doing versus the total support of the Western powers that just not just support but fuel Israeli military. And it's been, or I think maybe my algorithm is showing me that this is taking such a toll in people's lives and in people's joy or in people's sanity and in people's mental health. And at the same time, we are living in this world which is living its hottest year in record, while a new COP is coming, and this climate crisis combating summit is being just now cynically supported and financed by the oil lobby, made in oil countries, in just new microsites that simulate cities made in the most unsustainable way possible, with the private jets and everything that is happening, and is just this horrid phase of impossibility for solutions. So is there still room for utopia? Is there still a room just to be or to dream with plausible change? Has your aim as Jasmine changed from that?
No, I think that it's more important than ever to have the dream, because I also think that as the system keeps amping things up, there's more and more precarity and more possibility for things to shift quickly, you know? So then you have to have the goals, the dreams of what it can be. And it's really easy to just give up and, you know, say it's hopeless. But that also is, you know, that is something that then is accepting, you know, basically the death of, you know, all kinds of people, the ecosystem, everything. It's like basically acquiescing to the violence, you know, giving in. And so I don't know, I feel like our most powerful actions are the ones that have a utopian core that made people say, oh yeah, that is possible. Why isn't that world happening? Why aren't we doing that? And so I think that you can't give up those dreams. That's, you know, even though there's a lot of pressure too, because you're constantly reminded that you're powerless. But the other thing is that we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. And, you know, obviously, you know, the shit that's happening in Gaza right now, it's been a fucking terrible couple of months, and but it's weirdly also, there's a lot of people around the world who are now looking at that, and, you know, there's some there's more visibility, you know, and maybe more possibility as a result, besides the static situation that had been, not static, but the status quo which people were living with was already pretty bad, and it got a whole lot worse, and that's making people recognize, you know, it's weird, it's obviously not related to the tactics of civil disobedience, but there are ways in which movements of civil disobedience, things had to get really bad before they could get better, and the visibility of the badness had to be there in order for them to get better. And things like, you know, the Indian independence movement, they recognized that you had to have the eyes of the world on the violence of the British state to start gathering the support that was needed to create change that needed to happen. So, I mean, this thing with the fucking climate conference being basically run in the Emirates by oil company executives is completely bonkers. It's like you couldn't write that into a script, you know? It's like, I know, who should be in charge of this? Oh, let's see, what about those guys? They run the oil companies. It's completely nuts. But maybe that's one of those things where, okay, this needs to become completely insane in order for this change to happen, in order for people to be outraged enough to, you know, take control again, or to try to exercise control. I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of scientists who just say, well, it's too late, you know? But you can't really accept that if you believe on some level in humanity, in the idea of humanity itself, you know, or whatever humanistic values. If you think that there's something there to being human that's special, you know? If you're going to hold on to that, then you have to hope and dream about better things.
Ok, la respuesta es que no, que al contrario, es decir, el sueño, mantener el sueño vivo es más importante que nunca, precisamente por el nivel de dificultad que supone, y precisamente por el nivel de deterioro en el cual se encuentra todo, y que pues, sería muy fácil simplemente declarar que el mundo no tiene esperanza alguna, pero al mismo tiempo pues no es así, es decir, como que pues por un lado sus acciones más poderosas como Yes Men son las que tienen en el centro un ideal utópico, como que son las que le permiten ver a la gente como, ok, esto sí es posible, ¿por qué esto no está pasando? Y esa pregunta tiene poder, pero al mismo tiempo pues entiende que uno está haciendo, a uno le están recordando constantemente que no tiene poder alguno ni control sobre los horrores que pasan, y esto es un poco lo que está ocurriendo en Gaza, como el nivel de deterioro de verdad del humanitarianismo y pues la violencia que está cayéndole encima a la gente, hace que uno constantemente esté siendo recordado de su propia capacidad de nada, pero al mismo tiempo tiene un elemento positivo que la gente esté pudiendo verlo todo el tiempo, es decir, que la gente esté pudiendo entrar en contacto con esta información, y que obviamente la esperanza consiste de alguna manera en pensar que cuando peor se pone es porque está muy cerca de ponerse algo mejor, es decir, que las cosas tienen que deteriorarse mucho para que la desobediencia civil se convierta realmente en un movimiento, para llamar suficiente gente, para sobrepasar el umbral de, supongo, encallecimiento de la gente, para que la gente pueda tomar acciones, pero que básicamente uno no puede aceptar, es decir, que, pues, que con esto del clima, o sea, ni siquiera libreteado sería creíble que alguien decidió poner a cargo de la lucha contra el cambio climático, de los acuerdos internacionales para combatir el cambio climático, a las empresas del petróleo en los países del petróleo, que eso es una absoluta locura y que obviamente es un fracaso en un momento en donde además los científicos están diciendo que ya es muy tarde, pero que un poco eso es, o en eso consiste la esperanza, en eso consiste el sueño, en que si uno cree que de alguna manera es especial la vida humana, o si uno cree en las posibilidades de lo que significa ser humano, no puede aceptar que es muy tarde y tiene que activamente un poco hacerse cargo de esa esperanza y mantenerla viva, porque también es un poco la única manera de seguir, la única manera de poderse plantear formas distintas de hacer y formas distintas de funcionar. So, Igor, thank you so much. I hope I've translated it to do justice to
it was
what
amazing. I listening to the amount of that you can listen to and then repeat is pretty impressive. You've been doing it for a while, like because I just got going and going and going, and I'm thinking, yeah, how are you gonna? And then you just do it, so it's good. Yeah, it's like cool. Yeah, all good. It's all good. I wanted to show you the Barbie commercial that we made for the
Please
Eco Warrior Barbie. It's got a good music.
Eco Warrior Barbie.
Here, yeah, it's kind of like a wait. Yeah, I'll start it again.
Made of mushrooms, she's the best. Eco Warrior Barbie, putting bad guys to the test. Eco Warrior Barbie.
You have the bolt cutter?
Yeah. She's the one who takes control.
We're almost there. Locked out. Rest. I'm too late. I'll go file a lawsuit.
When adults are wrong, she'll do what's right.
That was a perfectly good bucket of poo.
She'll go anywhere, even France.
Daryl, Julia, Phoebe,
Rena.
Not afraid to serve the cause. Eco Warrior Barbie, corporate criminal sabotage. Eco Warrior Barbie.
Pussy Riot masks sold separately.
Recuerden que De Vital Importancia es un podcast de Capital Sonoro, el área de contenidos sonoros de Capital, Sistema de Comunicación Pública, y que no podría ser posible sin la dirección de Santiago Rivas, la producción ejecutiva de Carolina Pinzón, la edición de Adriana Castellanos y la investigación de Juan Pablo Conto y Nadia Orozco, más las múltiples funciones de quien les habla, María Cuestas. Recuerden que también pueden escucharnos en otros de nuestros shows como Capital Político, Respeto, nuestro podcast de música, Ahora un podcast y los demás que se nos vayan ocurriendo. Además, pueden conversar con nosotros en todas las redes sociales porque en todas nos encuentran como @Canal Capital. Gracias a todos y a todas y a todes por escuchar.
Capital Sonoro.